thejournal.ie's Budget 2018 Facebook Live. I'm here, Sinead O'Carroll, news editor, with KBC's chief economist, Austin Hughes. And it's the morning after the day before, and there's still a lot to take in from Paschal Donoghue's first budget. So we're going to go through some of the things. First off, Austin, kind of one of the things that came to me yesterday, we got a statement from McNamara Firma that said this budget was an inch deep but a mile wide, and I thought that kind of summed it up. What's your take on this year's budget?
Yeah, I think I'd broadly agree with that. What the Minister is trying to do is stretch fairly limited resources as widely as possible and make sure he doesn't really offend or hurt anyone in the process. So I think in that sense it's a budget that's holding time. It's probably a budget that's intended to set up the opportunity for an election next year. In terms of the economy, it doesn't do any damage. Everyone probably has a few more bob in their pocket, so it will help consumer spending, but it's not doing anything dramatic. I would point out, though, however, it's a budget that highlights how far we've come. Remember back just a few short years ago when the budget was to be feared because we just didn't know how large the tax increases were going to be or where they were going to come from. All we knew was it was going to be bad. So in that context, while you wouldn't say yesterday's budget was brilliant, it's far, far removed from the really brutal budgets of the last few years, and that's a really good development for the economy and for everyone who lives and works in it.
So is it about the political feeling that's out there, like, OK, we won't have a huge amount of extra money in our pockets, but we also won't feel badly about what's happening around us? Yeah,
I think there's a sense that they're trying to set up maybe the election manifestos for next year. So there's a sense we have increased social welfare, we have reduced USC, we have increased tax bans. There's something for everyone to claim. There will be plenty of photo opportunities over the next while. Nobody is going to feel dramatically better, but the intention was to suggest that things can get better. And by the way, there was fairly limited resources yesterday. The reality is that there should be scope for a little more largesse, or if you want, giveaways over the next couple of budgets. The critical element is this sets up most of the main political parties in a position where they can say, we've made progress, and they will promise a great deal more if they're elected.
I guess so. You mentioned USC and income bans. That's kind of the biggest thing that'll impact people's take-home pay. Do you want to explain, like, who will that affect mostly and why those changes were made in the way they were? Obviously, USC, we've talked about abandoning it. We've talked about, subsuming it into PRSI. What will actually the differences mean to us?
Well, the differences for the average person are going to be very limited. You're talking about something that ranges from maybe €1 a week up to €6 or €7 a week, and it's broadly balanced. No one is going to get 20 or 30 euro a week. The intention was to spread it widely and spread it thin. So in that regard, the movements in the USC are probably reflective of political promises. There is a sense among economists that it did broaden the tax base, and in that context getting rid of it is narrowing the tax base again, but we have seen promises to reduce it. The important element in terms of the increase in the tax bans is to try and reduce the number of people who move into the top tax rate so early. That's a real problem of the Irish tax system. We didn't do very much for that over yesterday's budget, but again it gives people the possibility of saying we've made a little bit of progress, and if we're re-elected, if we're setting future budgets, we're going to deliver a lot more. So it's the promise of a better tomorrow.
So that's the €750, that kind of tax band was raised €750. Does that bring us in line with other countries, or is it still that small that we still have a long way to go?
We still have a fair way to go. We have an exceptional tax system in so many ways. We actually have possibly the most progressive tax system in the Western world, but people move on to the higher rate really, really early. If you're earning very, very little, you're paying low income taxes relative to other countries, but you really hit a wall very, very fast, and that discourages enterprise. It really creates quite a significant bottleneck in the economy. what was done yesterday isn't going to do very much in that regard. But as I say, it signals that this is the intention. You will see modest increases. And there probably also is a signal that you're not going to get rich overnight, no matter where, that future increases will be modest, but they should be larger than we saw yesterday.
And a lot of people, when they're looking at their pay packets, and a lot of people at the moment looking at this housing crisis, how will I manage to get a mortgage out of this pay packet, no matter how much USC or income tax I'm paying? We had a comment from a commenter, Audrey Connell, who said, how do first-time buyers benefit from this budget? Both myself and my partner work extremely hard, and yet we find it very difficult to purchase a home. The prices of housing are increasing and it's a bidding war. So yesterday there was a lot of things mentioned in the budget about housing and various measures. We heard of a vacant land site tax, we heard of capital gains changes and the commercial stamp duty. Can you explain how or if any of these measures will actually help that supply problem?
Okay, well, let's talk about it in the round first, I suppose. We're just after talking about the income tax concessions, and they're really, really small. So there's no sense that people are going to have much increased wherewithal to buy. And there is the retention of the Help to Buy scheme, which is significant because there had been some possibility that that would be removed. So we're not going to see demand increase dramatically, but it will remain strong because we are seeing an improving economy, more employment, more income growth, even if it's modest. And that means that we're going to see this sort of bidding war remaining in place for a while. The key question is, can we raise supply quickly? And what we saw yesterday was the government again offer a very a la carte menu, or try a lot of things at once in order to boost supply. So the various measures that we saw are intended to try and free up supply. It remains uncertain as to how quickly they will work, how well they will work, which parts of them will work and which parts of them will actually give us some unpleasant surprises. I think in a broad sense, and we can go into the detail in a moment, we're not going to see a dramatic change anytime soon. Some of the initiatives, the vacant site levy, only hits in 2019. A builder can't suddenly get up today and decide he's going to build tomorrow morning. It is going to take 2 to 3 years before we see a significant increase in supply. But what we saw yesterday was a stick and a carrot. The carrot is various incentives, new funding for builders. We saw the various measures in terms of the capital gains tax as well. So we've seen a combination of initiatives. Which one of them is actually going to work? As an economist, I can't honestly tell you. No one can be sure of that. But what we can suggest is that they will increase supply. That will take time. We don't know how fast, we don't know how far that will move, but it's probably likely that, again, this is a terrible sort of reply for your commenter, but if you're looking for a house in 2020 and 2021, you will probably have more options. But tomorrow is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, because Pascal's big talk, and one of the lines that stuck out was he said, if developers are sitting on land, the message is clear, get developing urgently. But then the vacant site tax seemed to have been pushed out a little bit. Is that the correct reading of it?
Yeah, I think so. The reality is, with the best will of the world, you can't turn a field into a fully fledged functional sort of housing scheme overnight. So it is going to take some time, and I think that is the critical message. It would be counterproductive really to implement these sort of measures and suggest that they're going to have an impact from tomorrow on. The likelihood is that they will encourage people to think a little bit more about moving over to builders and developers to think about moving over the next year or two. So this isn't going to be an instant fix. There isn't a magic fix for housing. This is a problem that's been really a feature of the Irish economy for the last 20 years or so. And, the hope is, and I do use that word, the hope is that some of these measures kick in, but we haven't any grounds to say this will definitely work. This will definitely produce X houses in Y area by 2018 July,
Speaking of the problems we've had in the past, negative equity is a phrase that we don't use very often in the news anymore. But mortgage interest relief was brought in to help those people, and there was news on that yesterday as well. It's going to be tapered off. What does that mean for people actually still in this situation?
Yeah, well, rather than been removed overnight, as had been the plan initially when the mortgage interest relief scheme was introduced, it's now been tapered. So whatever you got in 2017, you'll be getting 75% of it in 2018 and 50% in 2019. So they're reducing it gradually rather than going cold turkey in terms of this. And it does make a difference for people who are stretched, because again, this group that you talk, the negative equity, and those who are simply squeezed, even if they're not in negative equity, you know, they've probably kids have come along, they've a lot more outgoings than when they first bought the house. So, you know, these sort of measures make a huge difference to the monthly budget, and to that extent that's a welcome development, even though it still signals this is going to end over the next couple of years.
Okay, just a commenter on Facebook there who said, Austin, this was a Skittles budget. There was little meaningless sweetness for everyone, but little real there was a little meaningless sweetness for everyone, but little real substance. Would you agree?
Very generally, I would. I think, as I say, the intention was first, do no harm to our election prospects, and that meant spreading it as thin as possible. Now, again, they would argue, and there is some justification for this, saying that at least there's a little bit going in rather than a lot being taken out, as was the case. So we have moved to a better place, and they're suggesting we will be to a better place. But what it is, because it's politically driven in that sense, it's not focused. They're not saying this is the area that's most important to us and we're going to put a lot of attention into that. The reality, as we found through the boom years, of course, is that throwing money at lots of things, we threw a lot of money at the health system, we threw a lot of money at a lot of other problems, and we didn't get particularly good outcomes. So there is maybe some argument that modest increases will help, but I perfectly accept for, you know, your commenter there who's saying, I'm not going to be better off. This doesn't change. I was hoping for something more. Yeah, the budget lived down to expectations in that regard.
Yeah, and Donald Milmo Penny brought up there the sweetness, and the sugar tax is probably the one thing getting the headlines this morning, and, you know, people working out how it will affect them and how it'll actually work in terms of what will happen drinks, what will happen the price, what will happen to companies that make them. What's your take on it? Obviously, it has happened in other countries already. Have we learned anything from them?
I'm not sure that we have yet, because it is relatively new in most countries at the moment. I think the first thing, people are going to discover how good their eyesight is, because they're going to be looking at the back of cans and bottles and discovering, my God, there is sugar in this. I thought it was a perfectly good juice. And so in that regard, I think there will be an increased focus. And, you know, the government is hoping to raise 50 million or that, but I think it's more raising awareness and trying to nudge consumers towards seeing what is the sugar content of this. Should I move towards the lower element? And as I say, being hugely surprised in many instances with drinks that they thought were pure and fresh and that, and finding that they have a very high sugar content. So that's one element. Change consumer behavior, get them to focus on it. I think there's also a sense that they want to see the soft drinks industry also change its behavior. So it's scaled between 5 to 8. You attract 5 to 8 grams per litre. You attract 20 cent tax. Over that, it's 30 cent. Yeah. So that is in trying to incentivize the industry to pull back in terms of the amount. Again, this is one of the areas where we're going to learn a lot about Irish consumer behavior over the next while. And we've made some radical moves in the past in this one, things like the bin tax and that. So it will be interesting to see whether people's behavior does alter in this regard. I certainly don't think it's a case of trying to get money from soft drinks. I think it's a case of trying to get people to change their behavior. And this may be a test case for small nudges, as we call them, in other areas.
Because we actually did a fact check on it and looked at other countries, and in other countries consumption fell but then kind of raised a year later. So it kind of fell off for a year and then raised again. So it'll be interesting in Ireland. So say the smoking ban worked, as you said, the plastic bag worked. Are our behaviours a little bit different to other countries? countries. So will it work a little bit better here? And also we spoke to Lucozade, the makers of Lucozade, and they've already made sure that Lucozade doesn't have 5 grams per 100 millilitres anymore. It's already fallen down, and they're using sweeteners and things like that instead. So yeah, it's an interesting one to watch rather than revenue raising, as you said. Kind of the other headline getter today was social welfare, a fiver to everybody. Are we back at pre-recession levels yet? Where are we in terms of how much we give to welfare recipients?
No. Well, the difficulty there is the pot has gotten smaller. The public finances have been under much greater pressure. And of course, while unemployment is falling, we are an ageing society and that. So the government needs to be very careful about these sort of elements. It needs to be careful in lots of different ways. For economic reasons, you need to be careful not to disincentivize work. And that sounds terrible because, people are getting a fiver a week. They're finding it very difficult to get by. But equally, there are people on very low pay for whom that sort of increase changes the balance, and it makes them say, no, I'm better off maybe staying at home or not participate in the workforce, particularly maybe second earners and that. So, while it sounds really heartless to say that, there is a significant element in terms of incentives. Now, for many people, there is no alternative, that they actually rely on this to keep themselves on the planet. Now, in that regard, I think what you have to recognise is that increases are going to be modest from here on in. The government is going to be limited in the scope it has to introduce giveaways. Again, it's worth maybe putting this in an economic background. Yeah. We went from a situation back in the 90s where there was no money for anything to a situation in the early 2000s where it seemed we could pay anything. And that fed expectations, and it encouraged people to believe there will always be an extra tenner, there will always be an extra 20 quid. The reality is the demands on the public purse are going to get tougher over the next while. We will have, as I say, an ageing population. We need to be very careful about how we structure pension payments. We need to incentivize people to actually take out their own pensions as well. So there are all those elements. So there's basically these sort of economic arguments. There's the financial arguments that suggest you're not going to see a great deal more. I think the €5 is probably, again, given what we've said happened to income tax reductions, a case of spreading it around evenly, and you probably will see more of the same. But it isn't going to be a case that we see dramatic increases the way we used to see that 10 years ago.
On the pensions, is there an economic argument for or against the €5 top-up for all pensioners on the state pension?
Well, again, if I step back from the economic arguments, there's a basic needs element that people, in many instances are finding it really hard to get through to the end of the week and to put a little more than bread on the table, So I think there is an argument there that, if you're to have an economy, you have to have a society that works. And to that extent, you have to look after people. So, I'm not saying there will never be welfare increases at all. I'm saying that there are limits to it. And the sort of modest increases you're seeing here, the sort of phase, which seem very mean, that we're talking about an increase that doesn't come till March, whereas people have various spending commitments right now, those elements are intended to suggest that the public purse is not overflowing and that the scope for really significant increases in the future are small. In terms of the pensions, I'm not sure that it's absolutely designed to do this, but limited increase would encourage people to think more about contributing to their own pension pot. I think the reality is the elderly lobby is a significant group, as we saw at the start of the crisis. So I don't think we're going to see a case where the government says, no, go and look after your own old age. But I don't think we're going to see, people getting very rich in their old age on these sort of increases.
Another comment from Sharon Kavanagh via Facebook. So good to see people are commenting. If you want to ask Austin a question, just leave your comments below the Facebook Live. Sharon says she's self-employed. So what does this budget do for her? Relatively little. I think that, in the
the round, what it does is say the Irish economy is in a good place. The budget doesn't alter that. The prospects are reasonably good, even in the face of so many uncertainties like Brexit and US tax changes, or potential US tax changes. I think the stronger economy is probably the best it's going to do for people who are self-employed, that is going to allow them hopefully see their revenues increase and their incomes benefit over the next while. The reality is you're not going to be hugely more incentivized by what happened yesterday, nor are you likely to see dramatic changes in your circumstances over the next while. There had been a range of measures touted as possible support mechanisms for enterprise over the last while. They seem to have been put on hold, and it may well again have been that political considerations said, hang on, let's see until we're in post-election environment and it doesn't look like we're giving to the self-employed, who, like economists or bankers, are probably deemed to be much better off than others. So I think there is maybe some hope that you will see an improvement in the return to enterprise after the budget. It is going to be fairly modest. And if I was more pessimistic, I'd say when you look at what happened in the actual budget day, we suddenly found this 1.1 billion, but there was an extra 830 million in revenue increasing. That suggests the balance is tilting a little bit towards a government that wants to spend more and perhaps tax a little bit more as well.
You mentioned Brexit there, and I was surprised that there was very few mentions of Brexit yesterday during the speech. One of the only ones was the Brexit loan scheme for self-employed people. Will that be helpful? Do we know very much about it yet?
We don't. I think that the issue there is we don't know an awful lot about Brexit yet. There's a huge amount of talk about it, but we're really still in the dark as to what exactly it will mean, what form of relationship the UK will have with the rest of the EU, what that implies in terms of the border, what that implies in terms of trade with Northern Ireland and the UK. And it's only until we have a little bit of clarity there that we can actually say, that's the problem, that's what we need to do about it. It's quite interesting that this year so far, to be honest, I would have expected a bigger Brexit effect on the economy, but exports to the UK are doing really well. We are seeing impacts in terms of tourists from the UK, and that probably fed into the decision not to increase the VAT rate on the hospitality sector. We're seeing changes in behaviour again, more people opting for imported second-hand cars, but we're not seeing the sort of widespread devastation that was envisaged, and it really takes a crisis to get the government really moving and introducing elements. So you will see incentives, there will be initiatives, loan schemes, probably more encouraging people go out and find out more. Enterprise Ireland is doing a fairly good job in this regard already, but I don't think we're going to see any dramatic initiatives there until the evil day of Brexit dawns, whenever that might be.
Okay, the usual things that we're talking about the day after budget are cigarettes and alcohol. So we obviously saw cigarettes go up 50 cents. That'll mean, I spoke to someone yesterday who said their packet will be 11.10 now, and so others will go up to €12. But nothing on alcohol. I think I know the answer to this question, but why?
Well, first of all, the cigarettes is a fairly easy one. Again, you can imagine in terms of the health arguments and that, and the politics of it, it makes perfect sense there. The question is, will it raise huge amounts of revenue? There is a threat, of course, of increased smuggling, so I'm not clear about that one. But it again ticks the right boxes in terms of increases there. On alcohol, it's quite interesting. I think, again, maybe people should talk about Brexit in terms of that, but they aren't going to. We already have very high excises and duties on alcohol. The reckoning is that of a €10 bottle of wine, something approaching €5 is going to the government. So there is a strain there, and there is a risk that you would see smuggling or that you would see changes in behaviour that mean the government doesn't get the revenue, and it probably wouldn't work out improving the health of the people that much. So there is that sense that they're pulling off that. I think they're at the margin, and it's only at the margin, it also is one of those elements that it doesn't impact on the cost of living, and because of the economic statistics suggest that people from poorer sort of means tend to smoke and drink more. They didn't want a budget that was regressive. So for all these various reasons, I think they're saying, let's be careful. If and I am a drinker, I'm not going to be celebrating and saying, no, we're not going to have higher taxes. The reality is this is biding time, and I think we will see Ireland remaining one of the higher taxed economies for alcohol, and it probably will increase in upcoming budgets. I don't think you need to go out and drink today, but you know, I think it's a temporary reprieve rather than something that signals taxation is changing in a different way.
Okay, for the day that's in it, we'll end on the rainy day fund. It was the first thing that Pascal brought up yesterday. 1.5 billion is going to be transferred into this rainy day fund. Can you explain to us what it is, what it's for? It was kind of Michael Noonan's baby a little bit, but Pascal is obviously keen on it as well. What does it mean?
Okay, you look out the window today and you see it pouring, and you hear people talking about the crisis in health or in housing, and you say, what do they define as a rainy day? I think the sense there is that they want to keep some sort of leeway against the possibility that you would get back to real boom and bust spending. You might remember the famous words of a former Minister for Finance that when I have it, I spend it. And there is that sense, if you look through the really minute detail of the numbers yesterday, there is a sense that the economy is expected to be stronger over 2019, 2021, and what was a big issue in last year's budget, fiscal space may actually be opening up a little bit further. So the rainy day fund is one sort of pre-allocation of this, so that we don't get the minister saying, well, I'm going to just cut taxes on this, I'm going to reduce or increase welfare spending on that, and that you get back into a real auction politics environment. Now, 500 million is a fairly small amount in the context of 60 billion of government spending, so it isn't a dramatic element. It's again a signal, and I think you will see some further increase in that if hopefully the economy picks up. But I do think you're more likely to see the focus of any spare cash going into infrastructure investment and perhaps more generous budgets than we saw yesterday.
Okay. So not all doom and gloom, a few glips along the way. But that's it for this morning. I hope you enjoyed that Facebook Live with KBC's Chief Economist, Austin Hughes. If you have any further questions, we'll have lots of budget coverage coming up. And we have Pascal Donoghue and Leah Varadkar in Facebook studios later this evening. So tune back then.